changing a company from public to private in Brazil is very painful because the state-owned culture is something that permeates the company from top to bottom, mostly at bottom. There's a myth in Brazil that you need to bend rules and break rules to be successful in your objectives. But that is a myth because you can do business successfully. You can actually build solid structures and solid companies and corporations in Brazil without bending rules or breaking the law.
Hello and welcome to Brazil is Not for Beginners. Today my guest is Alex D'Ambrosio. Alex is a lawyer and former executive at a number of large Brazilian businesses, including Vale, Santander, Votorantim, and other places. Alex, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Isaac. It's a pleasure to be here. Always fun to talk to you, and I really think it's a great idea for us to have this chat and talk about some issues about how to work in Brazil, how to live in Brazil, how to do business here, and I'll be looking forward to it.
We've been talking about this chat for a while, and I'm excited to do it. I think we've had it a couple times, just the two of us. And so we'll see how we do now that people are going to be listening in. But you've had a really rich career. You've done a number of different things. Like I said, you were a lawyer. You spent time while you were growing up in the US. You spent time working in the US and studying, obviously, here in Brazil, where you're based now, going back and forth, a lot of international experience. And I think we could spend multiple hours chatting about your career and background, but I'd really love for us to focus on two main topics today. So one, kind of your international experience and your job working with Brazilian companies, but taking an international perspective. And so maybe getting some lessons from that experience on your end. And then the other thing is corporate governance, which is something that I know you've worked very closely in and that we've talked about a little bit. And so I would love to get your insights and thoughts on corporate governance in Brazil and how that's developed over the years, what your experience has been, lessons that you've learned in some of the experiences you've had. But maybe for starting out here, like I said, you have a rich background, so I'm going to ask you to keep it brief, but if you could tell us a little bit about your background and your journeys between the US and Brazil.
Okay, thanks, Isaac. No, the topics you're raising they're all really interesting. To talk a little bit about myself, I think it's important to say that I was born in Brazil, born in São Paulo. And when I was about 1 year old, my dad, who was an academic, he went to study in the US. He went to do his postdoctorate degree at Brown. So I moved to the US when I was about 1 year old and ended up staying there for about 10 years. So from there, I lived in Providence, Rhode Island. And then I went to Buffalo, New York, which is where I have most of my memories as a child, right? I was from 5 years old until 10 years old. I was living in Buffalo, New York, upper state New York. It's a border with Canada. So it's probably the place that snows the most in the US.
Yeah, we've seen those photos.
Exactly. And I was raised with a lot of snow. It was always fun when school was out because of the snowstorms. And that's what I remember the most.
Yeah, there's no snow days here in Brazil, are there?
Not that I know of. Actually, there's one place in Brazil that makes actually really good wines in São Joaquim in Santa Catarina.
Okay.
It snows every year, and I don't know if they cancel school for that, though. But back to Buffalo. So I went to elementary school in Buffalo, and I finished the fourth grade, and my family moved back to Brazil, and I then went into fifth grade into a Brazilian school. And from there, I stayed in Brazil, and from age 11 to the end of college, where I went to law school in Brazil. Shortly after graduating from law school in Brazil, which is an undergraduate degree, as you know, then I went back to the US because I had a scholarship to study there and ended up doing my master's degree, then my JD degree, and stayed there practicing as a lawyer for another 12 years. First in Boston, then I spent 9 years in Washington, D.C., and then 2 years in New York City. And always in Washington, D.C., and in New York, I was working with major law firms where I ended up doing a career as a lawyer until I became partner of a firm. Then I moved back to Brazil. This was in the late 90s, right, in 97. I moved back to Brazil at the invitation of one of my clients that as Brazil was starting to do privatizations and they were doing public concessions and project finance. And I was brought to Brazil to this company to help them set up an in-house project finance practice. And project was for 2 years. I was on leave from my firm and 2 years turned into 3 and 4. And I've been here like 28 years. It's a long leave. I'm still on leave. When I meet people from the firm as an alum, I still say, hey, I'm still on leave.
Yeah, I'm coming back. Save my office.
Exactly. So then life developed here. And in the US, I always worked at law firms, right? And coming back to Brazil at the invitation of a client, I became in house for the first time. And that was a lot of fun. I enjoyed that so much that I'm still in house till now, right? I just left my last position as in house counsel at Vale a couple of months ago.
When you went to the US to study, did you think you'd spend over a decade there? And then what was it like coming back?
Interesting. Coming back to Brazil as a child was very traumatic, I must confess, because I was raised as a gringo. I was raised as a
Yeah.
US person, right? A
And,
child.
and the buffalo wings in Brazil are really,
Not the same, not the same. So I was raised pledging allegiance to the flag of the United States of America in school my whole childhood. So coming to Brazil, where I found things a little less structured, and even in school, it wasn't as structured a school as I had in the US. And culturally, things are very different, as you know. And as a child, I did have some trouble adapting, but in retrospect, that was an enormous advantage that I had in the course of my life because it taught me about adaptability. It taught me about cultural diversity and cultural exchange. So I think in hindsight, it was really a very good experience coming back as a child. Then I started to be raised as a Brazilian child. So I ended up being, I'd say, bicultural in that sense. So I was raised both as an American and a Brazilian. And when I went back to study, I didn't have any definitive plans whether I was going to stay for a year or two or longer. And I just settled so easily back into the United States. I felt so much at home that I ended up staying and started my life there. And the secret, I think, when we talked about this the other day, when you move from one place to the other, you need to move with a sense of permanence. You don't move as a temporary.
yeah, you said the one place that you went temporarily didn't work out.
Didn't work out. Yeah. Because you always feel that you're not there for the long run and you don't settle in, you don't develop roots. So when I went back to the States as a student, I ended up developing roots and I bought a house and I ended up making a career. And when I moved back, I did the same. I did expect that I would stay for only a couple of years, but quickly that changed and I ended up staying here for good.
Understood. And I want to talk a little bit about, one of the things is kind of maintaining that international lens and that bicultural perspective in the work that you were doing, but you were also stepping into a place, and maybe we can continue, not exactly chronologically, but kind of walking through what you've been doing in Brazil over the last 20 years since you came back. But the roles that you worked at were largely at multinational companies, but also at Brazilian companies that were privatizing. So you said you came back during this privatization period. And so can you talk a little bit about that experience of coming from the US, international perspective, big law firm stepping into a state company or a former state company and trying to help them privatize?
Okay, let me step back a bit though, because I don't think I answered your previous question about what was it like coming back to Brazil the second time. I spoke about coming back the first time. I had a cultural shock when I came back the first time as a child, and the second time I did not have a cultural shock. But then I had worked my whole career until then as a lawyer in the United States, as a US lawyer. Even though I advised Brazilian clients and other foreign clients, American clients, US clients about doing business in Brazil and vice versa, I had not had the actual experience of working as a lawyer in Brazil until then. So that was an interesting change in how I learned to do business in Brazil. I came back to Brazil at the invitation of a big construction company, a developer called Odebrecht at the time. It was before any of these issues and scandals appeared with Odebrecht. And it was an enormous learning curve also because I immediately started to do a private project finance. The company was getting into all sorts of privatizations and investments. We were concessionaires for all the roads that were privatized. There were roads in Portugal that we developed, the roads in Argentina. There were hydroelectric plants and energy concessions, and then telecom as well. And all of this was being privatized in the late 90s because it was the government of Fernando Henrique Cardoso, and they were changing the economic landscape of Brazil. So I actually surfed on that wave. It was really, really exciting to be a part of that at the time. And then one of the companies that was privatized was the mobile phone systems in Brazil, and I was invited to be general counsel of one of these. And then I lived in Brasilia as part of that experience. So state-owned company that suddenly became private. That was a very interesting experience because changing a company from public to private in Brazil is very painful because the state-owned culture is something that permeates the company from top to bottom, mostly at bottom. So you can change
Yeah.
the top management, bring privatized private managers and private market managers, but the culture of the company is still very much in tune to some nepotism and favoritism and some sense that you can't get fired because you're a state-owned company. So that's a change that if you take over a private company that was formerly publicly owned, the first challenge, I think, is to change the culture of that company so that everything else will work. Where I started doing that, it was called Telemig and Telenorte. It was this mobile phone company. It was part of the Telebras system. And we ended up changing a significant amount of people. That was important. But I've always had these experiences in going from one company to another. I always like to work with the people who are there. And it's a better challenge for a manager is to actually find the right places for the talent that you have at the company and work with them. And that's what we were able to do. And the cultural changes we did very much with internal communication and training and leading by example. I think walking the talk comes first from the top management, and that actually trickles down to the whole organization. And that I think applies for everything, starting from compliance and mostly from compliance to work ethic and productivity.
That's really interesting. And I really like both those points. You were talking the other day about you showed me a photo of yourself with your hero, Obama. And I remember an interview with him that I think he was on the Mark Maron podcast and he talked about changing government. And he says it's hard to steer an oil tanker. You can't kind of yank the wheel. You need to move it slowly and you need to find those degrees. And I imagine it's similar when you're taking over these public entities. And I think one of the other things about this, and, without getting into politics or anything else about this, is maintaining institutional knowledge. And so even if there's a public sector culture, people do know their jobs and know what they're supposed to be doing. And I think sometimes when you change people out very quickly, how to maintain that institutional knowledge while steering the tanker and trying to get it to turn without tipping over. And so I'm using a number of metaphors here, but maybe you can go a little bit deeper on some of those practices and talking about that change process and where corporate governance comes in on that.
Okay, you're spot on the issues about the change in government, and that applies to government-owned companies as well. There's a book that I like to refer to that talks a lot about this, about the big cultural change at IBM. It's called Teaching an Elephant to Dance.
I've heard of that one. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very old book. I don't remember the year it was written. It's written by a guy called James Belasco, and it's about empowering change in your organization. And the premise of this book, which is a lot of what you said, he explains based on the animal trainers in the circus. Yeah, how do you teach an elephant to dance? You actually first teach him to move the right foot, and when he's really learned that, he's got that down, you teach him to move the left foot. But when you start the left foot, he forgets about the right foot. So you have to be continually reteaching and retraining and exercising the whole movement process of the elephant. And that's how you actually promote change in an organization, is not simply by telling people, sending, here's a manual and you follow these new rules. It's actually by exercising continually the whole change process. And that comes from the top. If you don't show that, if you don't walk the talk, you will never be able to impress that change in the whole structure of the employees. And on that note, I worked with in other companies after I was in telecom for 4 years, and I did a startup as well because the state-owned company also then led to a startup in a wireline company. Then I went to Votorantim Group, which was the largest private family-owned conglomerates in Brazil. They had a bank, they had the largest cement manufacturer in Brazil, the largest zinc producer in Latin America, the largest orange juice manufacturer, and pulp and paper.
A true conglomerate. Yeah.
And I was the head of legal for this whole organization. So had the opportunity to work in all these different sectors. It was a tremendous work experience. And the idea here was to transform a family-owned business into a multinational. When I joined Votorantim in 2003, Votorantim had only one asset abroad, that was in Canada. And when I left 13 years later, we were present in 36 countries. So that was quite an expansion in those 13 years. And that was also a cultural change that we had to show people that came in from a family-owned business where there were people who were connected to the owner since childhood and who expected that they were there for life. Some of these people that didn't adapt to the new culture ended up having to leave. And then new people came in and to impress a new style and a new organization with family out of management. So that was an interesting change and a very successful story, the Votorantim Group, that it's in their fourth generation and they're still very large and successful and still growing.
How do you work through getting leadership buy-in for this? So you talked about, teaching the elephant to dance and kind of it starts at the top, but how do you get the top to buy in? How do you do that? And what is unique about trying to do that in Brazil and with Brazilian families and Brazilian companies and Brazilian work culture? What led to some of the success and maybe what were some of the challenges in doing that? I know it's been a few years since this happened, but I imagine the lessons are still quite useful.
No, of course, and it's still happening. So it's been a few years when it started, but I think it's happening. Let me actually try to answer your question diagonally. Okay. First, talking about what's unique about Brazil. I think Brazil has a tradition in corporate organizations that most of them are still family owned, right? So the family brings its own culture. They started probably 2 or 3 generations ago. The most successful ones are in their second generation.
The grandfather starts it, the father builds it, the son runs it, and the grandkid spends all the money, right?
That's a story. But if there are some studies that show that, I don't remember the percentage, but more than half of family owned companies don't survive until the fourth generation, unless they can actually shift from family owned to professional management and do that successfully and let go of that family owned culture. Now, while it's family owned, and I had that Votorantim was a family owned company, the family had already bought into it and had decided that they needed to let go. Otherwise, they wouldn't survive because they read the statistics, right? They saw what was happening in other companies. So they hired McKinsey to help them review their governance. And the McKinsey recommended that they bring in a professional team of managers and that they step out of management. And I remember when I interviewed with the head of the family, one of the patriarchs, I never forget this interview. He said, well, we realize that competence is not hereditary. That's why we need to hire management like you, and that they need to bring in fresh ideas and fresh blood. So with Votorantim, which I think is a very good example and been followed by others, the family itself had together decided that they wanted to make that change, and it worked. Now, there are other family businesses that I observe in Brazil that don't really want that. They bring in sometimes a board that is really just a consulting board, and they don't follow what the board tells them that they should do, and it ends up being just perpetuating their own culture. But then you have a different type of company in Brazil, which is recent, which are the true corporations. That's an example of Vale. For example, Vale was privatized in 1997
Yeah.
and 96, 97, and has since become a true corporation with no defined ownership. That creates a different type of governance because the boards in this company are much more complex. There are representatives from different investors. They have international investors like Church of England and BlackRock, these huge funds that select professional board members that not necessarily are people who had any management experience in the past. And that's why it's difficult to run a true corporation in Brazil at this time because we're still learning how to put together a board in such a complex situation. Vale was starting to become a true corporation just when the accidents happened, the dam collapsed. That's, I think, one of the biggest challenges was for the board to have a sense of ownership and empower management to get things done. So for Vale, the learning curve came a lot from tragic experiences from Mariana and Brumadinho.
Yeah, you started at Valley, and I know we're going a little bit chronologically, and we skipped your time in banking as well.
Yeah, I'll tell you, that's also an interesting comparison about the governance because of the banking experience. I'll talk quickly about that right now.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah.
I was executive at Santander Bank in Brazil at a time that the bank was going through a very drastic cultural change as well. But in terms of experience, it's been terrific. And in all these companies, these are companies that were going through important changes. Santander was going through a change where the CEO at the time was named Sergio Real, became very well known. He was trying to bring a new way of banking. And I was part of this new management team where he was trying to bring a new perspective of how to treat clients,
Yeah.
and I think that's been a big change in the market that I've observed in the finance industry. Back to Vale. I joined Vale in 2018. It was about a year and a half after there had been a Mariana Dam collapse. It was a tailings dam where the dam collapsed, killed, I think it was about 19 people at the time in 2016,
Yeah.
and raised big concerns about safety and security of that type of business. I was brought into Vale with a mission that was a mission to solve the Mariana problem and try to renegotiate a settlement agreement with the government and with communities that would put that to rest. And 10 months later, there was the Brumadinho dam collapse, which was a different dam. This one owned totally by Vale. Mariana was owned by Samarco. It was a different company that was a 50-50 joint venture between Vale and BHP Billington at the time. But this time at Brumadinho, this was all Vale, right? It was 100% owned by Vale. I had been there 10 months, just enough time to actually organize the legal department and the tax department and the governance. And when this happened, everyone was taken back by something that couldn't happen. There was this perception that a dam like that could not collapse because Mariana was a fluke, was one of these one-time black swans. And this one, then nobody believed that it could happen to Valley, and it did. And I think there's a big change in perception. There had been massive investments in risk management and dam management, but we assumed then that something didn't work in the way management was happening. We hired professional studies to understand what had caused that, and it turns out that it was a phenomenon that even the scientists and the experts had never seen before, which is called instant liquefaction, because some tremor that happened was just enough to trigger liquefaction of the entire dam content and led to the tragic collapse of the dam with 270 people that were downstream from the dam and they died.
Yeah, real tragedy.
Yeah, it was a tragedy. And as the head of legal, I was put in charge of the first response efforts, crisis management that came from that. And for the first few months, I was head of the crisis management. Then it went to the engineering and operational, and I dealt mostly with the settlement agreement that I negotiated then with the government and with the communities. And that took about 2.5 years. And once that was done, we were able to reach a settlement that made people feel adequately compensated. Then I turned again to the Mariana Agreement, which we concluded a revised settlement agreement at the end of November 24. And that's when I decided that it was a good time for me to step out of Valley.
Understood. So now we've walked through your career here, and I think this, I mentioned the through point of you finding change situations, you finding opportunities where companies are at a pivotal moment of transition culturally as an organization. And this last story about the two disasters at Vale, I think, is maybe one where we can dive in a little bit deeper about. You mentioned Vale had been on this transition of being a public company to becoming a true corporation. And can you talk a little bit more about some of the learnings that you saw in how to do that and where there were missed signals, whether it was leadership or middle management? Where did they miss signals of things not being right? And how can other organizations that are going through maybe not quite as much of a change learn from that? And I think, sometimes it takes a disaster or an extreme case for people to learn and wake up to something being wrong, right? We're often the frog in the boiling water. But thinking from a corporate governance perspective, which was what we wanted to talk about, what can organizations do to be prepared for those types of things, to think about crisis management before it happened and
Yeah.
not miss these noises that are probably bubbling up and that we're ignoring?
Yes, that's a very good point. I think what we learned from the Vale experience and the Brumadinho experience particularly is that first, nothing is exactly what it seems, right? I think that was a lesson learned, that board members and the role of the board truly has to be intense questioning and re-questioning and digging deep into issues. So I think the first point in the cultural change that we tried to impress on Vale was communication. There has to be fluid, clear, and transparent communication in all levels of the organization, from bottom to top, and mostly from bottom to top, because that's where you actually have the risks come up. For that to happen, that will only happen if you have a psychological environment where people feel safe. People feel safe to speak, to explain, to bring out problems. And I don't think that's unique to Brazil, but I think it's very strong, especially in companies that are state owned, that were state owned in Brazil, that people don't like to speak about problems. They don't like to raise issues, especially not bring them up to their management.
Yeah, I think something that's come across a few times where, Brazilians are a bit people pleasers. You don't like to say no. One of the people I interviewed, and I brought this one up a few times, but, in Brazil, a yes is a maybe and a maybe is a no.
Yeah, that's absolutely right.
But there's also and I'm curious if this was the case at Bali and some of these other organizations where you've looked at the change management, but just very strong top down leadership. The executives have their own dining room. There's a bit of a separation between the executives and the workers. And it seems like a pretty strong wall to overcome. You're told what to do. Decisions really get made only at the most senior level. You narrow data. You don't bring everything up. And so was that the case at Vali? I don't know. Again, big organizations I think are different in different ways, but to narrow the question down a little bit is when we think about what you were talking about, which I think about psychological safety, which is obviously more of a Silicon Valley concept, I think, in some respect. How do you bring that to an organization like that in Brazil, where you have these traditional top down management and these silos and walls and various barriers to communication?
And these silos, as you say, these are not unique to large organizations nor to state-owned organizations, because at some of the privately family-owned businesses, that also happened. There was a sense of hierarchy. And
Yeah.
when I joined Valley, that was one of the projects that we had, even before the disaster happened, that we were in the process of breaking these silos and breaking the hierarchy of communication to create an increasingly safe psychological environment. So the transformation that happened at Valley and was sped up actually because of the accident, that was already in the works. We were trying to do that to make it a better environment. But I think what we found is that it's not overnight. You can't just snap your fingers and make it happen. Again, as I said earlier in this conversation, you need to walk the talk. You need to send the example. You need to show that you mean that to the people that you're working with. And the executive team at Valley at the time, we were all very much committed to make that change happen. And we reached out to the employees. We brought the employees to speak with management frequently, and it was getting better. And today, I think it's much better in that sense. But you're right. I think one of the problems in big organizations, and the bigger the organization, probably the more the problem occurs, is that people don't talk to each other enough. I think another point that was an experience that came through, the board really converged in their desire to fix things. And that the board, as I said earlier, in a true corporation, sometimes difficult, people are not aligned in interest. This
Yeah.
tragedy actually brought people together, and the board worked together. They had probably met every day during a couple of years, and they empowered the management team to make things happen. So there, we created a harmonious relationship between the board and the management that was essential to be able to put together an agreement and to make things better.
Obviously, coming out of these disasters at Vali, corporate governance internally and rebuilding trust with your workforce and your team members and driving that cultural change. How does it work externally as well? Can you talk a little bit about that aspect of rebuilding trust, of changing the perception of the culture and the perception of the company among outside, I don't know if you'd call them stakeholders, but outsiders as well?
Yeah, stakeholders for sure. That I think the best way to change perception of a company that's been through that kind of tragedy is to say what you mean and mean what you say. You have to be truthful, speak only about things that you know, no speculation, no promises that cannot be fulfilled. And as you know, in Brazil, I believe there's a sense of optimism that is one of the virtues of our culture in Brazil. People are very optimistic, and people don't like to deliver bad news. People don't want to seem negative about something that's going to happen. And so, don't worry, things will always work out in Brazil. We believe that in Brazil. But when it comes to corporate culture, you can't be excessively optimistic. You can't sell optimism. And sometimes there are many companies that when they do market guidance, for example, they forget that market guidance has to be truly based on facts and numbers. And some companies will put out guidances that are just what they wish. It's a wish list. It's not necessarily a fact checking list. And I'm not saying this happened at any of the companies that I worked with, but I've seen this happen in other companies. And you see crises lately about Americanas and now Ambipar. These are companies that ended up promising things and were afraid maybe to reveal the truth when it was still a possibility. They said, well, we'll fix this eventually. We don't need to tell the market because at some point we'll fix it. And then it snowballed into the problems that we see now. And I think that happens. And in the companies I've worked with, I think I've been fortunate to never have to deal with issues of compliance that would actually place anything at risk. I led the group, the compliance team at Votorantim and then at Santander and at Vale. And I'm pleased to say, I'm very proud to say that these companies have all been immaculate and never have ever been charged with any violation of any law or regulation. But there's many in Brazil that you see, and I think it's probably because of that sense of optimism. Another point I think is very characteristic of Brazil, Isaac. I think there's a myth in Brazil that you need to bend rules and break rules to be successful in your objectives. The jeitinho brasileiro. But that is a myth. It's a myth that sort of it's perpetuated by many scandals and many situations where you do see that there's levels of corruption in various levels, both of government and private sector. But when I say it's a myth, it's because you can do business successfully. You can actually build solid structures and solid companies and corporations in Brazil without bending rules or breaking the law. And that is sometimes a deterrent for foreign investors in Brazil. They say, oh, going into Brazil is always a risk. It's like going to Indonesia or going to the Congo or something where you have high levels of corruption. Brazil is not like that. The corporate culture in Brazil today, I think, is very strictly based on compliance and concerned about that. And my background as a US lawyer was very valuable in my career in Brazil, bringing that perspective and always fighting against that myth that you need to break and bend rules in Brazil. So I'm happy to say that I've had a successful journey in my career in Brazil as a US lawyer practicing in Brazil, learning how things work here, but without ever having to violate any ethics. Now, how things work here, Brazil does not work in the linear way like things in the US mostly work. So if you don't get to point A to point B through a straight line, you need to sometimes zigzag. That doesn't mean bending rules. It means that you have to understand the context, understand what base influences decision making in Brazil.
Okay.
Decision making in the US probably more linear and more rational. In Brazil, many other factors come into play that are not necessarily the rational factors. I think as an example, you need to say you're looking for an environmental license. Many years ago, I'd say that licensing was simply checking the boxes in your application form. If you fill out this application, you check the boxes. I'm doing this investment here, I'm doing this there, check them all, everything is compliant, you get the license. Nowadays, especially in Brazil, licensing is a holistic matter. You need to check all the boxes, but you also need to look at the stakeholders that are affected by the license that you're applying for. You need to see how the communities, how the local schools might be affected. You need to understand how the indigenous populations will benefit or lose from this. The local politicians have to be on board. So you need to actually create an environment where everyone that is somehow touched by your license application understands the benefits that it brings to them. Again, that does not mean that it's a quid pro quo. Oh, I'll give you this if you give me the license. What it means is you need to converge the interests of the company with the interests of the community. And that takes more time, takes a lot more effort, and it takes an understanding of how the community thinks and works. So the best way to do business in Brazil is to understand your environment deeply and connect with the environment, connect with the employees, because employees have an enormous power to prevent things from happening. You can tell them this is the directive, and everybody says, sure, we'll do it. And then nobody does it, and then it won't happen. So you need to engage your employees, but you also need to engage the community and the regulators that are involved. That's how you get things done in Brazil. It doesn't mean breaking any rules, it simply means engaging more people.
I love all of what you said. And I shared a list of questions before we chatted. And I think you've touched on a lot of the points that I wanted to get to, but kind of wrapping up around these points of building this convergence of bringing people together. Is there any more practical or tactical advice that you'd give to business leaders generally? I think we can talk about foreigners afterwards and kind of advice for foreigners, but you've been working in Brazil with Brazilians for a long time. And so you mentioned some of the recent scandals around Americanas and Ambipar. What does good governance look like in Brazil going forward? And beyond good governance, how do you build that convergence of interests? How do you get people on board? And, you've mentioned kind of, walking the talk from a leadership standpoint, but what other advice do you have for them to avoid these scandals and to bring this convergence and build for the long term and build stakeholder equity or stakeholder growth and stakeholder interest?
I think I could summarize this in 4 points and start with knowledge. And the board needs to understand what the business is about. The board needs to understand what is affecting the business. And the board can't simply base its understanding on what it reads in the press and what people talk about. Again, the board needs to actually inquire and learn deeply. That brings to a second point, which is very important. The board needs to trust in management, and there has to be a mutual trust here. And you can say, well, there's some examples of scandals where the board trusted so much in the management
Yeah.
that they didn't actually find out what was going on. But then you need to have a deep understanding of who those people are that you're working with. There's an advice that I'd give to any investor, local or foreign, that know the people that you're working with, know them well, understand what they do, know their families. One of the persons that you interviewed talked about a tactile type relationship in Brazil, right?
Yeah.
That you need to know people a bit closer in Brazil than you would in the US, for example. I worked
Yeah.
many years in the US, many good friends that I had actually never went to their homes or never met their families and never talked to them about issues outside of work. That's fine. That works in the US. In Brazil, you will only know people that you work with if you really get closer to them. That doesn't mean you also have to invade their homes or spend every weekend together, but you need to understand what their backgrounds are, where they come from, and what makes them tick. So I think that was the second point I was talking about, trust. Third point, you need to have clear and transparent communication with management. We talked a little bit about that already, but it has to be constant and intense. You need to create the psychological environment that allows that to happen. So management has to know that the board trusts them. You can't be afraid to go to the board and get massacred by your board members. I've seen that happen, but there's a bit of a bonfire of the vanities of the board sometimes, and the board member wants to show off to other board members.
I imagine that's also that goes down, right? If there's the ability to go and question and have those tough conversations, senior management to board, it's also creating that from senior management to mid management and mid management down, where you're building that psychological safety and that environment for questioning and for trust.
Absolutely. And the years that I was at Vale, it was 7.5 going on my way to 8 years at Vale. I believe we did establish that very good relationship between the board and management with the psychological safety and clear communication. And that trickles down. Again, that comes back to the walk the talk. We may not perceive this when you're on the board or on the upper management, but everybody sees and knows everything that goes on at the higher levels of the organization. So Alex talks to his employees in a certain way, people say, "Oh, great, that's nice to know." And they try to emulate that in their own relationships. If there's a CEO or a chairman who actually talks down to his employees, that empowers those managers, middle managers, and lower
To
management
talk down on
to
their
talk
employees.
down on
Yeah.
their people. And the opposite also applies. So the walk the talk, the message from the top is really very important in having these behaviors.
Yeah. And people see what you do regardless of what you say, right? I think that's the point there.
So to have these behaviors actually work in the entire company, you need to first practice them yourself in the upper management. The board needs to understand its role, to understand their role. The board's role has to be hands off, nose in, and that sometimes is not the case. If you have former CEOs on a board, people who are recently CEO and become board members, they still think that they are CEOs and they want to put their hands in. And the board has a very important role in directives and supervision, but not in managing the company. And that is not that well thought out in Brazil yet. I think there's some companies that haven't yet figured that out, and the board has to really be clear in its role.
Yeah, amazing the 4 points. You said you had the startup experience as well, and I talk to startups. My last episode was with an early stage startup that's looking for product market fit still, right? So they're, talking about building their culture with 8 employees, right? So how do you begin to build those items? And then again, from a foreigner perspective, how can you help support that and drive those changes while respecting the cultural differences and the cultural benefits of the local culture?
I think most importantly, Isaac, you have to lay it all out. You need to talk about these items. There's an expression in Brazil. I know that you're fond of Brazilian expressions.
I love them.
Pôr o bode na sala, meaning put the goat into the room, right? The US has a similar one about the elephant in the room. But here,
Yeah.
put the bode na sala means you have to put the difficult topics on the table and talk about them. And one of the things that needs to be discussed and openly discussed between management and board is the role and the limits of each one of these entities, right? So the management team has to speak to the board about, look, you're going too far. You're asking for too much information. You aren't allowing my team to actually do their work. You're disempowering me before my team if you have me do this. So that has to be very open and transparent. Then again, the communication comes to play. For a startup, I think people need to bring in experts that will help them see sometimes what they don't see themselves and avoid the frog in the hot water situation. Because by the time a problem arises, it's too late sometimes to fix it. You won't fix it quickly, at least. And that comes back to one of your first questions. How do you prevent problems from happening? How do you prevent a crisis from happening? It's constant discussion, constant debate, inquiry, and laying things out and talking about them.
Interesting. The communication is really important. And it's a little bit of a two edged sword in Brazil because you're trying to build the personal relationships. People don't like to say no, people like to please, and driving towards the transparency can be a bit hard, especially as people move up and are used to the old culture. And so I don't know that I necessarily have a question here, but I think that it's a balancing act, especially for foreigners coming in, to help promote that transparency and push for that transparency while allowing for the Brazilianness to continue to exist.
Brazilianness. That's a
I was looking for words. I don't know. I
no.
didn't know where to really end that one.
Yeah, I think you're right. Foreigners coming in, I think they have to necessarily come in slow. I think understand where they're stepping into, understand the environment. That doesn't mean be weary of the environment. What it means is come in with the sense of permanence, as we talked earlier about my
Yeah.
personal life. If somebody comes to invest, you have to think of investing and participating, actually not simply putting in a quick turnaround, but actually engaging in the business, participating in the business, having local partners that really understand the culture, the Brazilianness of the environment, and understanding that stakeholders here there are many more stakeholders in Brazil than you might find in other countries. Again, a US corporation, you can sometimes identify your stakeholders quickly. Here, there may be some hidden stakeholders. There may be communities that you're impacting that you're not aware of. You have to pay attention very closely to the environment and the context in which you're working. Some competitors here that you may not even be aware that exist. There's so much of an informal economy in Brazil that some items may not appear in the diagnoses that you have your consultants put together.
If you try to time the market and kind of come in quickly to Brazil or ride a wave, you're not going to succeed. That you need to invest, that you need to, like you said, bring some permanence or approach it with the idea of permanence, whether it is permanent or not in the long term. But
That's right. It doesn't have to be permanent. You just have to, it's the attitude. It's the permanence as the attitude is not necessarily the result.
yeah,
And
you can always sell your house and move to a new one, but you bought the house and you lived there, right?
yeah. And I think something important to say about doing business in Brazil, that's a message that I often tell colleagues from abroad. In Brazil, the Rolling Stones line applies very clearly. You can't always get what you want, but if you try hard, you'll get what you need, right?
Okay, I love it.
And again, it doesn't mean that you won't get what you need. It's just that sometimes, as a straight line, you may not get to that point. So you need to be adaptable and flexible in your objectives when you're in Brazil. You may start out thinking that you're going to achieve $1 billion revenue in a year based on your business plan. Then you realize that may not happen. You don't give up. You may come up to $2 billion in 2 years, but you may go through a whole zigzag and bypass what you were first planning, but then you end up getting what you need and what you want. Sometimes it's not what you want, but it's what you need.
Yeah. No, I think that there's a perception of linearity in the US. Whether it's true or not, I think is also debatable. I think we post rationalize a lot of things after they happen to make them sound linear, but that's a different story entirely. But I think it's just a different path sometimes. And, in a lot of things, you think you're going to take a step and that's going to lead to this point and then the next point and the next point. And it's not that it's not even not linear in Brazil, it's just different steps and a different
Yeah,
type of path
different type of path.
sometimes.
But there's a lot of uncertainty of things in Brazil, right? And things can change very quickly, very rapidly. The government can come up with a brilliant solution how to raise more taxes, and that goes immediately and hits your business on the head. And you
Yeah.
say, I didn't see that one coming because nobody could see that one coming.
Yeah.
And then what you need to do is you need to think it over, readjust, maybe change some of the ways you did things and move on. You have to learn how to move on. That's why I talk about the flexibility and adaptability. I think we're seeing some changes in the US where there are a lot of unpredictability coming into play
Yeah.
in the current administration. And that's part of the shock that you see of many people in the US is because they're not used to unpredictability. They're
Yeah.
not used to sudden change and measures that could never happen. I hear that a lot of my American friends. We don't understand how could this happen? I mean, it
Yeah.
happens because it can happen. And in Brazil, we expect it. There's some very drastic changes that happen sometimes coming from government. And you say, well, that's part of the game. It's part of doing business in Brazil. Change is implicit.
That's a great point, and something that gets repeated regularly here is that sense of change and uncertainty. And I always like the quote, even the past is uncertain in Brazil.
That's a
But
great one. Yeah.
are there any unique red flags or unique green flags that you'd highlight for investors and foreigners as they look at Brazil, just as a a last point, kind of wrapping up this idea of doing business in Brazil as a foreigner, and specifically the corporate governance side? Are there things that you see that, sound okay, but people should be wary of, or that sound strange, but no, that's actually a really good practice, and that's something that makes a lot of sense in Brazil?
We talked about most of them, Isaac. I think it's the nothing is exactly how it seems. That's
Yep.
one that's really important. And I'd add another one that it's actually, I don't remember the writer. It's a British writer who said this, and I use this a lot, that while nothing is certain, anything is possible. Because of this uncertainty that we talked about, so many things can happen out of the blue that you weren't expecting. Because of that, anything here is possible, but not only bad things, it's also good things are possible. It's a world of possibilities. So it's a green flag, I'd say, that this uncertainty that people sometimes may be afraid of is also what breeds so many new opportunities and possibilities. So Brazil is truly, it's a new frontier in that sense, right? You can still come up with new ideas, things that there's so much yet to be done here. There's so much
Yeah.
to be developed and implemented. And because the rules change also, it's not that the rules are flexible, but rules change on the way as people perceive the need to evolve. The government can be an ally in that sense, helping you direct your choices based on the rules that are in flux.
Right. I think it ties back to your point on kind of aligning incentives and engaging the stakeholders and getting everyone involved and understanding the benefits in the right ways and how everybody benefits. Like you said, it can take longer, but in the end, it can maybe even lead to better outcomes. Alex, this has been really great. I always like to wrap up my episodes by asking my guests two questions. And I always like to start by asking, what does the expression Brazil is not for beginners mean to you?
Brazil's not for beginners, I think, means that you cannot come into Brazil assuming that you know things. You have to come into Brazil with an open mind and a willingness to learn. So you have to truly believe that when you come to Brazil and start doing business here, you will come out a better person, a more knowledgeable person, a more experienced person. And that's when you can say that you're no longer a beginner.
I love it. I like that. It ties a lot to what you said about the adaptability, the putting down roots, the coming in and wanting to not just invest money, but invest time and capacity, right? And then I also like to ask, and we've had a few of them already. You've shared a few expressions and a few habits, but is there anything that is particularly Brazilian to you? Something that you did in the States that your friends were like, Alex, why are you doing that? Or even when you came back as a kid and you were like, why do people do this?
I think a good one that works in the States, so we end up seeing that as well, but it's a very typical Brazilian expression, which is acabou em pizza, meaning that when you say you're struggling with the competition, you're struggling with the problems, you're struggling with authorities, at the end of the day, there's a path through settlements. People will find a way, they'll find a middle ground, and it will end up in pizza, meaning people will be gathered around the table and finding a common solution. In the United States, when I worked there, I did a lot of settlements and arbitration and that kind of thing as well. So somehow that works as well. And the second one, this one you've heard, is about quebrar o galho.
Yeah.
Means breaking the branch, right? What that means is people sometimes expect that they'll find a way. You ask somebody to help you find a way, and that's quebrar o galho. That's a very typical Brazilian expression. There's so many, right? There's so many here that it's interesting to research the origins of these expressions because they come from historical backgrounds and they stick on, right?
I love it. Alex, this was a lot of fun. I always enjoy our conversations. Thanks so much for sharing some of your wisdom. You mentioned at the beginning of the episode and a couple of times throughout that, you recently stepped down and you're looking at next things. How can people reach out to you? How can people engage with you? How can people follow you?
Well, I stepped down on a beginning of a sabbatical, and as I said to you earlier, I'm open to persuasion now, thinking about the next steps. There's many interesting opportunities that people have been reaching out. I'm taking my time to decide, but I can be found at LinkedIn. LinkedIn is usually the easiest way to get in touch. It's been a tremendous run in the past 28 years that I've been in Brazil. Learned so much and continuing to learn. As I said, I'm still a beginner, right? You say Brazil's not for beginners. You have to be a beginner in some sense to be willing to learn new things.
Yeah, I love the expression and the idea of a beginner's mindset and the idea of maintaining it because also if you think you know the way, then you miss the obvious ways, right? Oftentimes an expert knows it can't be done and the beginner finds the way. Like I said, Alex, this was a really great conversation. Really appreciate all the time and hope people reach out to you to follow what you're up to next.
Thank you, Isaac. Thank you. It's been great talking to you. It's always fun, entertaining, and especially great learning from you as well. This has been a lot of fun.
Excellent. Thanks so much for listening, everyone. Thanks again for joining us. This podcast was hosted by me, Isaac Matzner. It was produced and edited by Maria Filmis. You can find more episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and YouTube, as well as on our Substack page. We do love feedback, so please feel free to reach out to us on social media or via email at Brazil, the number 4, beginners@gmail.com.